Hi, everyone. Welcome to CODEPINK's weekly webinar, What the F is Going On in Latin America. We spend 20 minutes every Wednesday, 12 p.m. Eastern, talking about hot news out of Latin America and the Caribbean. I'm very pleased to have my co-worker, Leonardo Flores, join us today. Leonardo is one of our Latin America campaign coordinators, and he's also a policy expert on Latin America, on the region. Latin America and the Caribbean. Today, we're going to talk about potential U.S. military intervention in Venezuela and/or a potential full naval blockade. As many of you may know, last week, Thursday, at the White House's Coronavirus Task Force press conference, the president took a moment to kind of hijack the task force press conference and mentioned that he was going to be sending naval ships to the Eastern Caribbean, which is the north coast of Venezuela. So, and then prior to that, we also had the narco trafficking charges filed by Attorney General Barr against Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro. So we're going to spend the next 20 to 30 minutes talking with you about what the White House, Pentagon, State Department has in mind for Venezuela and what the events leading up to this potential military invasion have been. So welcome, Leo. I'm so pleased to have you in conversation with us today. It's really nice to have you here, and your recent articles have been so informative for our CODEPINK following, and I will place those in our chat so that people can either reread them or read them for the first time. You can also find them on CODEPINK's Facebook page. So welcome, and why don't you give us a brief background as to what this buildup towards a potential U.S. intervention against Venezuela looks like.
Thanks so much for having me on, Terry. So we have to understand this buildup in the context of the Trump administration's ongoing regime change efforts, and also with how it relates to Trump's military threats. So Trump first threatened Venezuela militarily in August 2017. He first threatened a naval blockade in, I think it was 2 years later, in August 2019. And this deployment, which is a massive deployment, the biggest one in the Caribbean region in 30 years, since the invasion of Panama. We can talk about that in a little bit too as well. It's huge, right? So there's dozens of naval ships, dozens of airplanes, and thousands of troops are being sent in what the White House is calling a counter-narcotics operation. But of course, you know, as we've discussed before on the show, it really has nothing to do with drugs, because if it did, you know, the target would be Colombia instead of Venezuela, seeing how Colombia is the biggest producer of cocaine.
Can you just briefly tell our viewers how much actually goes west through the Pacific versus what's coming through the Eastern Caribbean, just as background, so people understand the numbers, the volume of trade?
Yeah, I think it's something like 80% of the cocaine that comes to the United States comes through the Pacific Ocean. Venezuela does not have a Pacific coastline. And then of the remaining 20, another, I don't know, about 13 to 15% comes from Colombia's Caribbean coastline. So we're talking about a very kind of small amounts in the grand scheme of things. Less than 7% of the cocaine in the US comes through Venezuela, and 0% of it is grown in Venezuela. Venezuela doesn't produce doesn't grow coca or produce cocaine.
So that basically is just an excuse. That argument is being used as an excuse to move the U.S. Navy into the Eastern Caribbean.
Yeah, and it's not the only excuse. So a couple of days after that press conference that Trump hijacked, the White House started talking about how they needed to move troops in order to fight COVID, saying that drug traffickers were going to exploit COVID and maybe bring more COVID into the country, COVID-19. And that's totally ridiculous. I mean, we saw what happened on board the USS Theodore Roosevelt, where so many of the crew members got infected and the captain was fired. I mean, I think this is going to happen more and more if there is a long deployment in the Caribbean. And it's really putting thousands of lives at risk, not just US service members, but the local people they interact with, because a lot of these people are being sent to bases that already exist in, say, whether Colombia or Panama or other countries in the region.
So it's a threat not only to our own troops and citizens, but also to foreign citizens that either live near these bases or work on these bases. You know, there's something that I just want to detract for a moment. I read an article about the quote unquote Spanish flu, and that there's an argument that it actually started here in the United States with US Army troops being sent from, I want to say Ohio, but I'm not sure, in the Midwest, sent to Europe to fight World War I. And then it mutated over in Europe and came back to the United States with troops. So it's really crazy how this spreads. And then you look at the fact that the United States has 800 military bases that we know of across the planet. So, and then of course the case with the aircraft carrier Roosevelt. And then you see Venezuela being attacked for possibly manipulating COVID-19 into criminal activity when our own federal government is not properly responding to this at home, which could be called criminal, in my opinion.
Yeah, and so it's worrisome because of COVID, and also just because it's basically the prelude to a war. So former U.S. Ambassador to Venezuela, William Brownfield, who's one of the architects of the regime change policy, you know, a lot of his emails were leaked by WikiLeaks, and you can see step by step how the U.S. has applied his strategy towards Venezuela. He called it the first step, or maybe not even the first step. He called it the application of this military option in the 21st century. And, you know, so that's certainly great reason to worry. And, you know, I mean, the White House is saying that these are going to be counter narcotics operations, but we have no idea what they're going to do with vessels coming into Venezuela that hold, you know, food and medicine, or with vessels going out of Venezuela that have oil or liquid natural gas. And so, you know, the White House itself, the Pentagon claims without evidence that drugs are shipped from Venezuela to Cuba on oil tankers. And so are we going to see the Navy board a Venezuelan oil tanker and seize it? You know, we've seen a lot of seizures of medical equipment over the last 2 months. It's not just the United States, of course. Lots of different countries are competing and stealing supplies from each other. And
I think you're being kind in saying seizure. Some people would call it piracy.
Yeah,
some people
absolutely.
are calling it piracy.
It would be, yeah, it is piracy. And so are we gonna see an expansion of this piracy to include oil and other assets and other, you know, resources? I hope not, but that's certainly the concern.
So you mentioned that potentially boarding Venezuelan oil tankers headed to Cuba. So we're seeing potentially the demise of two countries here, Venezuela and then Cuba, by not being able to get, most of the fuel is for transportation in Cuba, I believe, that comes from Venezuela. So you're looking at the destruction of two countries simultaneously as the goal.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's kind of been the Trump administration's goal all along. I mean, Obama had, while he kind of opened or had a rapprochement in relations between Cuba and the United States, he kind of switched Venezuela for Cuba as the regional boogeyman. But the Trump administration is taking both countries on, thinking that if one falls, the other one will fall. And so that's why you've seen a lot of sanctions, of the hardening of sanctions in the last couple of years on Cuba. And a lot of these sanctions are also related to Venezuela. So you've seen, you know, oil tankers themselves sanctioned, and just basically a harder line in general against both countries. And they're absolutely both related. And we have to say why they're related. Of course, it's because of Florida and its 43 electoral votes. Florida is a state where there's not just a lot of Cuban American and Venezuelan American voters, but a lot money is the more important thing, in my opinion. A lot of these Cuban Americans and Venezuelan Americans are very wealthy and have been funding and financing campaigns for both sides, or both the Republicans and Democrats, for years. But in Trump, they see an ally that's willing to do whatever it takes to make their dreams of regime change come true.
So, you know, this is a good thing you brought up the Florida, the Electoral College votes, and I think we see in the demographics of Florida losing the historical Cuban American vote that typically votes, you know, very conservative Republican, and more current generations, children and grandchildren of Cuban refugees, migrants, political refugees, whatever. We have a number of ways of classifying them. The younger people, the children and particularly the grandchildren, are voting differently. And so is that would lead for a different strategy for people like Marco Rubio and the president. And now there has to be a new villain, so to speak, to. And now, in speaking of villains, John Bolton has referred to Cuba, Venezuela, Nicaragua as the troika of tyranny. And we've been really pretty much focused on Venezuela, and we understand, I think many of our viewers understand, the very, very close alliance between Cuba and Venezuela and trade, in foreign policy, the founding of ALBA between Fidel Castro and Hugo Chavez. The other country that we're not talking much about, I'm kind of bringing this in, is Nicaragua. Nicaragua is considered one of the three countries defined as the troika of tyranny. How is this attack on Venezuela potentially going to affect Nicaragua?
Well, so far it's not clear how it'll directly affect Nicaragua, but Nicaragua is also in the crosshairs, and we've seen, and the NICA Act got passed in Congress a couple of years ago, and that it was a very similar act that got passed in 2014 against Venezuela, and that set the stage for the Obama administration's executive order calling Venezuela an unusual and extraordinary threat, and then also for the Trump administration's devastating sanctions. Nicaragua seems to be on that same path. We saw, I think I just read pretty recently that a couple of officials in Nicaragua were just sanctioned. I know that the Gray Zone has just put a great article out about Human Rights Watch's role in pushing for sanctions on Nicaragua. And something we have to really stress is that sanctions are warfare. Sanctions form an integral component of what's known as hybrid war. And there's certainly hybrid war been going on against Cuba for 60 years, against Venezuela for about the past 20 years, and against Nicaragua, it's really starting to heat up.
So I believe it was probably 2 weeks ago, maybe even 3 weeks ago, Thursday, where Congress had a verbal vote to expand financial sanctions on Nicaragua. And I'm really happy you mentioned the Gray Zone article, because this story of sanctions on Nicaragua is very, very quiet in the press, and things are happening behind the scenes. And that vote 3 weeks ago Thursday, no one is talking much about it, and it passed unanimously, I believe. So you're looking at three countries in the hemisphere defined as the troika of tyranny, and that are very tightly allied with one another, trade-wise, foreign policy-wise, healthcare, education policies that are the same, political philosophies that are very similar. And all three also trade very heavily with China. And do you see that as an prevalent issue, particularly for people like John Bolton, who say, the Monroe Doctrine is alive and well?
Yeah, and it's not just China, it's also Russia. And that's what led the State Department about 2 months ago to declare that the Monroe Doctrine 2.0 is in effect now. And it's all in an effort to make sure that Latin America stays as the US's backyard, so to speak. That's a phrase that really kind of gets people in Latin America very angry, but it's used by every administration has used it, I believe. And we have to really kind of draw a distinction between China's actions in Latin America and the United States' actions in Latin America. China acts as a country that respects its trade partners. It sees Latin America as not just trade markets, but potential allies. And it doesn't try to impose policies on them. Whereas the United States does the opposite. It tries to impose policies on these countries. It tries to, force domestic affairs to align with US domestic affairs and foreign policies as well. So that's why we saw the United States exerting a lot of pressure on Caribbean states in the last couple of years, especially at the OAS, for these Caribbean states to kind of denounce Venezuela, whereas China doesn't take that sort of attitude with its foreign policy. And that's really one of the key differences between, Chinese foreign policy and US empire.
So while we're talking about Chinese policy, let's do a quick compare and contrast about how the Chinese are responding, particularly in our hemisphere here of the Americas, with COVID-19 versus the US response. And I think this should be framed as we go forward with this part of our conversation, that this is perhaps a form of humanitarian warfare by the United States. And we had talked about, you had mentioned sanctions as warfare, and I think it's really important for our viewers to understand these different types of tactics that are being used. But let's talk about the difference between how China and the US are responding in the hemisphere right now.
Sure. I mean, for the US is weaponizing COVID. We saw William Brownfield, who I mentioned earlier, who called it the application of the military option. He also said that now was the time, it was the perfect storm to go after Venezuela even more strongly because of COVID, because of the sanctions, because of the low oil prices. Whereas China, and so we're also seeing, I just want to add that we're seeing the US take the same sort of measures against Iran and trying to figure out a way to take advantage of the disaster that COVID is causing in Iran to further its regime change goals. Whereas China is taking the absolute opposite route. It's giving humanitarian aid and medical aid and supplies and expertise throughout the world. And in my opinion, between China and Venezuela have saved, or excuse me, China and Cuba have saved Venezuela from a tragedy with COVID. Right now, Venezuela is able to undergo massive testing. So everybody who comes into the country gets tested for COVID-19. And there's lots of people returning, lots of migrants returning from Colombia, from Ecuador, and from Peru. There's even 800 people at least in the US who want to return to Venezuela. Everyone who returns gets tested and then quarantined for 2 weeks. Everyone who's come in contact with a coronavirus patient gets tested, and everyone who reports symptoms gets tested. And Venezuela has set up an online portal where over 17 million people have filled out health surveys reporting whether or not they have had symptoms related to COVID. And Venezuela has been able to do all of this because China sends tons and tons of aid to Venezuela, including enough, the first shipment had enough tests to test 320,000 people. Since then, there's been 2 other shipments of several dozen tons of aid. China's also sent several machines that can carry out these tests. Cuba has sent doctors and has sent tens of thousands of doses of interferon alpha 2b, which is a drug that can treat COVID-19. And so, from the so-called, bad countries, the evil countries in the world, from the perspective of the United States political establishment, what we're seeing is solidarity. And while the supposed good guy of the world, the United States, what we're seeing is more threats of war and more pressure on people. And that's leading directly to deaths in Iran, and it's leading to, chaos throughout the world.
So it's almost, it's horrifying to me. There are some mornings I wake up and read the news and it makes me, physically ill to just look at nations, and I would say Iran and Venezuela specifically right now, but perhaps others as they weaken physically with COVID-19 and start putting whatever resources, all their resources towards saving their own populations. The United States is basically looking at kicking a weak dog while it's down on a massive humanitarian level. I mean, there are some people that are starting to classify this as, the US potentially committing genocide in more than one nation. And so as far as weaponizing COVID-19, as far as the United States weaponizing it and these threats against Venezuela, this charade of sending naval ships to the Venezuelan coast, to the Eastern Caribbean, because the president of Venezuela is presumably, it's been identified by the U.S. Department of Justice as a narco trafficker, quote unquote. And let's talk a little bit about the history of using that narco trafficking label for U.S. intervention. It's really, how do we get our citizens to understand this as warfare? I mean, there are 2 in the House. We have H.R. 1004, which is no military intervention without congressional approval. It's not saying no military intervention. It's just saying without congressional approval. And there's a Senate Joint Resolution 11, that basically reinforces what the Congress is doing. And yet no one who has signed on to, at least as far as I know, no one who has signed on to either one of those, that bill and resolution, is stepping forward and saying, wait, what's the White House doing? What's the Pentagon doing? What's the Department of Justice doing? What can we do amidst this COVID-19? I know you and I have talked about it with our other teammates too, as to how, and maybe some of our viewers can email us with any ideas as well. How do we get people to focus on what's going on, behind the scenes here, as we're so focused on the coronavirus here at home?
Well, I actually think the coronavirus offers kind of an opportunity to raise awareness, because so many people are questioning our economic system right now, questioning the trillions of dollars being sent to corporations and to Wall Street and to banks, and the pittance
and
being
to the military.
And to the military, yeah, and the pittance being left over for workers and for everyday folks. And so, one thing we've done at CODEPINK, you should go to codepink.org/pandemic+war, sign our petition there denouncing the Trump administration's deployment. Take pictures of yourself or videos of yourself if you're possible with the slogan "Fight COVID, not Venezuela." Send them to your representatives and senators. I think we're limited because we're all stuck at home. At least the ones that are of us that who are lucky enough to be stuck at home and don't have to go out every day to work. But there's still opportunities to raise awareness, and that's really what we're limited to right now. It's really kind of a shame to say this. I think Congress will eventually come around when they start seeing more people die in Venezuela. Like, how many years did it take for Yemen to be on the congressional radar, and people managed to do that? It was a lot of hard work by activists and by people, aides in Congress who of conscience. And I think the same thing can be done for Venezuela. It's just going to take a lot of building from the ground up. And so that's why it's important to all come together and unify the peace movement, and not just the peace movement itself. We have to grow it and let people understand that we're spending all these billions of dollars in our defense industry and towards the military, and that doesn't leave enough money for things that we desperately need here at home. And it's creating generations of people who don't like the United States, frankly. And so we're kind of creating our own enemies and then spending billions of dollars to fight them, while at the same time that money is desperately needed at home.
We mentioned earlier in our conversation that this scenario of labeling a government official a narco trafficker. I remember clearly when I was significantly younger, the situation, the scenario with Manuel Noriega in Panama. And then, of course, in more recent years, last year, we've seen the president of Honduras, Juan Orlando Hernandez, his brother, indicted and found guilty of significant narco trafficking charges in the Southern District of New York. He was found guilty last fall, and the president of Honduras was named co-conspirator number 4 in that case, in that lawsuit. And here he is, still the presiding president of Honduras, a significant U.S. allied country in Central America. But let's talk a little bit about what happened with Manuel Noriega and what was going on in Panama, and that it was different there, and the reason it succeeded, and perhaps why this is not going to succeed in Venezuela.
Sure. And before I jump into that, I also want to add a couple of more people who have for whom there's evidence that there's ties to drug trafficking. Iván Duque and Álvaro Uribe, who are 2 of the last 3 presidents of Colombia, and Juan Guaidó, who was photographed with members of a drug cartel back in February 2019. And so, these are very huge U.S. allies in the region, and Colombia receives billions in security aid, and that aid has not had maybe even a dent in cocaine trafficking or production, and it in fact has been linked to the terrible human rights abuses that we see every single day in Colombia, where important social leaders and human rights leaders, environmentalists and indigenous and Afro-Colombian folks are being murdered, assassinated. But going to the point of Panama, you know, there are huge, important differences between Panama in 1989 and Venezuela in 2020. First, Venezuela is a much bigger country than Panama. It's got a population of 30 million people. It's much stronger militarily. It has much weaponry that has been updated in the last 15 years. Curiously enough, it had to be totally upgraded because U.S. sanctions implemented by George W. Bush forced Venezuela to begin purchasing new weapons from non-U.S. allies, basically from China and Russia, because Venezuela was prohibited from using and purchasing U.S. weapons or weapon components. And so it's stronger militarily, and it also counts with a militia that has 3 million members in it. And in the mainstream media here in the U.S., when the militia is mentioned, if it's even mentioned, mostly it is ignored. When it is mentioned, it is done so in a very derisive manner and mocking, the alleged senior citizens who form part of this militia. And there are senior citizens who form part of this militia, but I don't think they should be mocked. These are people who have been very clear in saying that they're going to risk their lives if any sort of coup or invasion happens. And we already saw them be activated back in February 2019, when there were rumors that an invasion was imminent from Colombia. Many members of this militia went out to and occupied the bridges between Colombia and Venezuela and said that they would not allow anyone to pass. And sure enough, they did not allow anyone to pass. And so you have the elements basically of what will be a years, if not decades long resistance in Venezuela should it be invaded. The comparison to Panama isn't apt. A better comparison would be either Afghanistan or Iraq or even Syria, particularly Syria, because Venezuela has very close relations with China and with Russia, and given the state of the world right now, where you have basically piracy of medical equipment going on everywhere, it's a very kind of delicate state we find ourselves in, where any sort of military action can spread, especially considering that in Colombia right next door, you have two guerrilla groups that are not insignificant. In fact, I think it was early February, there was a weekend in which the ELN called for an armed strike, and they paralyzed almost half the country, and nobody talks about this. It was barely reported in the mainstream media. But it is a kind of show of force by these groups in Colombia. And so any sort of war in Venezuela is going to spill over, and it's going to have disastrous humanitarian consequences.
What's your take on South America specifically, I guess the Caribbean island states as well, since that's where the naval ships are? What's your take on how surrounding nations are responding to this U.S. threat of invasion? Nations that are allied with the U.S. and nations that are allied with Venezuela.
So Cuba obviously has already denounced the U.S. threat and the U.S. deployment. The other Caribbean states, I'm not sure. I mean, I know that their position is peace, because the Caribbean states have always been on the forefront of advocating for peace, not just regionally, but across the entire world. Within Colombia, it's not so clear. Obviously, the Duque government in Colombia is very close to the Trump administration, but Duque is wildly unpopular in Colombia, and it's not clear that the people of Colombia would support any sort of invasion. Brazil itself has so much instability. Last weekend, we were talking about a possible coup underway in Brazil. It didn't quite happen, but it does point to the fact that there are fractures at the top levels of government and perhaps within the military itself in Brazil. And so, even if a lot of these countries wanted to, if the leadership of these countries wanted to take part in an invasion of Venezuela, they don't have the support at home to really carry it out. And I think we would see a lot more instability in these countries.
So regarding the region, we talked earlier about the Monroe Doctrine and this U.S. vision of, control of the hemisphere, no foreign entities, foreign bodies in this part of the world, this Western hemisphere of the Americas. No one coming in, trading or foreign policy wise, that's antithetical to the U.S. vision. But you and I and our other compañero Michelle, we are working on a project at CODEPINK to kind of work around that Monroe Doctrine philosophy of the United States, Monroe Doctrine 2.0 specifically, as John Bolton has been so vocal about. And that's our good neighbor policy. What does it mean to be a good neighbor here in the hemisphere of the Americas and as a global citizen? And I would argue, regardless of what political motivations may be, the Chinese are by far outshining the United States as a good neighbor, as a good global citizen, particularly what we're seeing, the aid response here in Venezuela and Cuba, and Nicaragua, and other countries, Iran too, Italy. So that's kind of a message that will be our job to help expand. What does it take to be a good neighbor? What does that look like? And the US is certainly not what we would define as a good neighbor right now. So let me ask you, Leo, is there anything else we should talk about before I let you go? We've been talking for 30 minutes and I promised you 20. So these conversations always get so much longer, and I'm so happy that people can stay and talk. So
yeah, I mean, I would just add, like, what we're still obviously conceiving of this good neighbor policy, but to me, it would be based on three kind of principles: non-interference, non-intervention, and solidarity. And that's what we've seen from other countries in Latin America during this COVID-19 epidemic, particularly from Cuba and China. And it's not just the Chinese government. There's been a lot of solidarity from Chinese billionaires. Jack Ma has sent, supplies to even to El Salvador, to several countries. Where are the American billionaires? Why aren't they stepping up for the region? They're barely even stepping up for the American people. So I think we need some very serious changes to our whole way of life and our whole way of thinking here in the US. And I think right now there's an opportunity to make some of those changes happen.
So, all right, everyone, we'll leave you with those final comments. You've been listening to Leonardo Flores speak with you this afternoon. Leo is one of CODEPINK's Latin America campaign coordinators, and he is a superb Latin America expert. There's two superlatives in one title for you. So I'm so pleased to be working with you because I learned so much from your analysis of everything. It's really a joy for me, and I'm really thankful that you had time to join us this afternoon. And all of you watching, you can join us next Wednesday, 12 p.m. Eastern, 9 a.m. Pacific on CODEPINK's YouTube channel. I would also encourage you to follow our Facebook page and look for announcements regarding other webinars we're conducting on different countries throughout the globe right now and their response to coronavirus. And then, of course, tomorrow, please tune in to CODEPINK Radio, WBAI New York, WPFW Washington, D.C. That airs every Thursday, 11 a.m. Eastern, 9 a.m. Pacific. So, okay, everyone, we'll see you next week. And thanks again, Leo. It was great to talk with you this morning or this afternoon. Okay, bye-bye, everyone.